Hello, my name is Edwin Rutsch, and I'm the director of the Empathy Center located here in beautiful Santa Barbara, California. The center's mission is to build the empathy movement and to raise the level of empathy in society through education and community building initiatives.
And my name is Anita Nowak. I teach at McGill University, and I'm the author of Purposeful Empathy, a book that invites readers to turn up the volume of empathy in their lives.
And at the beginning of 2024, Anita and I co-hosted the Empathy Summit, brought to you by the Empathy Center, and more than 40 authors of books about empathy participated.
They shared what their book was about, why they were motivated to write it, and what they hope readers will take away. Thank you so much for watching, and we hope you'll buy their book. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Arthur Ciaramicoli. He is a clinical psychologist with 40 years experience under his belt. He was formerly on the faculty at Harvard Medical School. He's the author of 12 books, including The Power of Empathy, a practical guide to creating intimacy, self-understanding, and lasting love. Welcome, Arthur, and over to you.
Thank you, Anita. Hello to everybody. I'm going to describe to you how the book, The Power of Empathy, came into being in the first place. It's dedicated to my brother, David, and this is relate to the question that was asked to Mentor a moment ago. My brother was 23 years old. He was 4 years younger than me, and this story involves when I was about 28 years old. So my brother was involved with drugs and alcohol. He was an alcohol abuser. And at a certain point, he got into using heroin regularly. And I was living in another state, so I didn't see him very often. But at a certain point, he had shot heroin in the morning and was drinking at a bar in the afternoon. And 3 individuals had decided to rob a restaurant. They were going to rob this restaurant in a local town. And the person who was going to drive the car decided to not do it. He was too afraid. So the other young man came into this bar and asked my brother if he'd drive the car. And of course, my brother was totally out of it. So he said, fine, I'll drive the car. He drove the car. The other young man went into the restaurant. It was closing. They had already closed, but it was an elderly man who owned the restaurant. The elderly man also had a heart condition. He pushed the man. He took the money out of the register and he jumped in the car. And this man started running after the car as my brother drove away. He had a heart attack and he died. So my brother fled to Amsterdam because he had been given advice that he needed to get out of the country before this kind of settled down. I and my father would send him money. He was there for a couple of months. And then we had a conversation where my father had obtained a criminal attorney and he would come back to the United States and be tried. And we were going to take care of him the best we could. So I was the last one to talk to him. I talked to him on the phone and he mentioned the word suicide, which is difficult for me to even say at this point, even though it was many years ago. He said, if I have to go to prison, I'll kill myself. And I did at that point what my father always did with the two of us. My father was a World War II hero. He was in the OSS, the forerunner to the CIA. My father would give us enormous pep talks. So I gave him a pep talk. I didn't say anything about suicide. I told him he was going to be okay. We would take care of him. He's strong. He's resilient, blah, blah, blah. And we hung up. And he was going to get on a plane the next morning. We had arranged to come to Boston. That night, he went to the Chinese section of Amsterdam, which they were selling very potent heroin, which he knew because he had been there many times before. He came into the bar restaurant where he was living. He said goodbye to everyone in the bar. He shook everyone's hands, including the person who owned the bar and restaurant. He went up into his room, locked the room, went into the bathroom, locked that door, and he overdosed with heroin. From that point on, for the rest of my life to this day, I have tried to figure out what happened, what went wrong, and what could have been different. I, at that time, read of all the major religions, I read everything I could. I read everything in psychology I could. I went to work for 2 psychoanalysts in a psychiatric unit, and I had been trained in humanistic psychology, so I was interested in their point of view. And I noticed at certain points they would sort of poke fun at an analyst named Heinz Kohn. So that kind of interested in me, and I wanted to read about Heinz Kohn and wanted to know why these classical analysts were demeaning toward him. Well, Cohen wrote a great deal about empathy. He called it vicarious introspection. So I started to think, because he also talked about how to produce empathic listening and how that would provide a sense of safety for a patient, and they would be more likely to feel secure and talk openly. I then came across William Ickey's work on empathic immersion. He said it's everyday mind reading. I say my definition is it's the capacity to understand and respond to the unique aspects of another human being. But it's not enough to be empathic. You have to use empathy. And empathy can be taught to anyone. We know that we are programmed for empathy. I've been doing relationship and leadership groups for over 35 years. And almost consistently, when I'm asked to add a man to one of those groups, I'm told he doesn't have the empathy gene. But what happens when they leave 2 years later? They have empathy. Why? Because it's lied dormant. They haven't been taught to open up, to be vulnerable, particularly men. And when they're in a group, men and women, they learn a lot about how they generalize by not using empathy. Empathy is one of the greatest tools to reduce prejudice. Why? Because when we learn about our prejudices and our biases, when we calm down and listen attentively, we start to learn, and in these groups, learn where we project. One of my patients is a very bright CEO, very, very wealthy, very successful. In one of my sessions, I had the window open in my home office, and there was a dog barking, which was irritating him. And he said to me, well, dogs don't like Black people. I said, really? They don't like Black people? No, they don't like Black people. I said, well, how did you come to that conclusion? He said, well, my mother used to teach us that at the end of our street in the corner, there was a Black family, and we had two golden retrievers, and we would never walk down the street because my mother said, dogs don't like Black people. So I waited a minute, a few seconds, and I said to him, have you ever been in the presence of a dog and a Black person? And he said, no. And he said, now you're trying to make me feel foolish. I said, I'm not trying to make you feel foolish. I'm trying to ascertain the facts. This is what empathy is. Empathy slows us down, calms us, so we can look objectively at the way we think and perceive. He realized that he had never been in the presence of a Black person and a dog, and he asked me if I ever had been. I said, I have a Black uncle who we call the dog whisperer. He trains all our dogs. And we went on to have many, many more conversations about his biases and his prejudices. What Cohen didn't know back then, and what I didn't know back then, but what I noticed, when I was able to listen empathically to another person, something was happening inside me and something was happening inside them. Now we know what was happening. Oxytocin was being released. That near miracle hormone that we know produces safety, security, trust. It reduces inflammation. It even is a key factor in weight gain because it reduces this obsessive cravings for food. I didn't know that back then. This book was published in 2000. It was just republished last year in China, which interests me more than anything because I'm so fascinated by the fact that the Chinese are interested in empathy at this point in our international climate. But we know that we can change brain chemistry by the way we listen and care. And in terms of Minter, what you said earlier, there's a multitude of studies in the corporate world that leaders who can produce oxytocin in their workers and their employees, they have higher profits than leaders who lead through aggression, who lead through fear, who lead through threatening. So what I would hope you would take away from my little talk and possibly this book is that I believe empathy is the most crucial capacity we have to live a healthy personal and professional life. It is everyday mind reading, as Ickey said. It's an assessment tool. It helps us look beyond the surface into the heart and soul of another human being. Who is this? Who is this person? We know when we slow down, and I always teach people in my groups to slow down, and that's when we learn about biases and prejudices. And I also teach them to slow down and listen. I'm sure with Edwin, your work, this happens in your empathy circles all the time. I've quoted Edwin, I think, in the last 3 books I've written, and in the one I'm writing right now, I do again, because there's no question that empathy circles produce oxytocin. How can it not be? There's a study that was released recently at the University of Haifa about Palestinians and Israeli kids. When you get them in a room and you slow them down and you make sure, as just the same technique as in an empathy circle, that they listen to each other, what happens? They start to realize this other person is a human being just like me. And their hate is diminished. Just like Edwin, you have talked about at rallies with Republicans and Democrats. It's critical when we can slow down and when we can teach our children and integrate this into our schools. I mean, my groups, because everything is Zoom now, all my practice is Zoom. So I have patients from all over the world.
1 minute.
Not too far? Okay. Okay.
No,
So
you have 1 minute.
okay. Just want to say the takeaway is expand your empathic range and encourage everyone that you know and care about to do the same. And it will produce a happier, more fulfilling life. Thank you.
Wow, I'm truly moved by everything that you shared. And I feel like all of us who are participating on the Zoom call are also, I think, feeling the effects of oxytocin and serotonin thanks to your vulnerability. So thank you so much, Arthur.
You're welcome.